Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. Today, we're going to be focusing on centering decolonization in your research journey. As you know, we have been talking about, or there has been talks, not only in South Africa, but around the world about the importance and the need of centering decolonization in the work that we're doing. So within our context, the African context, it's also important to think about centering Africanization as well. So today, that's what we're going to be focusing on with a specific focus on decolonization. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so before we jump into today's session, pardon me for a bit. Before we jump into today's session, I would like to take a moment for us to revisit last week's session where we were focusing on ethics and African-centered ethics. So when we ended the session, there were a number of questions that some of you had asked that we could not attend to because we ran out of time. And I promise that today, as we start the session, we will start by giving attention to those questions, and you will see they also link and they lead us, I think, seamlessly to today's session as well. So one of the questions that were asked was, are there sub-themes that you would need to cover as a student in your research work in order to know ethical principles in an African context, or to know whether ethical principles in an African context are adhered to? And so the answer that I would like to share is that there are no prescribed sub-themes for you to cover. And this is precisely because the idea is to avoid a one-size-fits-all. Remember last week we spoke about how our Euro-Western ethical principles tend to assume the idea of universality. And if we acknowledge and take seriously the different contexts wherein we're conducting our research, we're doing our work, then we would understand that one size fits all might be a bit of a challenge. So when it comes to the different principles or the different themes, when it comes to African-centered research ethics, it's always about context, right? It's important to look at the various guidelines and draw from the different guidelines, so to speak, to check what is it that is applicable to your own research. This could even mean drawing from the Euro-Western principles, because there isn't anything necessarily wrong with them, but the challenge is that it assumes that the principles can just fit in every context without acknowledging the different circumstances, the histories, the context itself, the diversity of that particular context. So even the kaupapa that we spoke about, the SAN code that we spoke about, can all be useful. So what's important is that you as the researcher understand what it is that you want to achieve, how do you want to approach your research, where, which community, which context are you going to be conducting your research, and as a result, what could be useful or beneficial for you as you conduct that research in terms of the relevant principles that you could adhere to for that research that you're going to be conducting. Okay. And then there was also a question. It was my view that action research naturally is participatory. To some extent, yes. However, your presentation suggests there's a difference between participatory action research and action research. Can you share more insights? And so I've then come up with the definitions of the two different, these two kinds of research, so that you get an idea of how we approach each one and what each one focuses on. So with action research, you're investigating a phenomena with the aim of practically solving an issue. So the idea with this kind of research is that there's going to be a practical action that is going to happen, that is going to take place as a result of this research that you're going to be conducting. So it's about social action in addition to producing data. So it's not just about producing data, about knowledge production. That's part of the process. But as part of that, there's also going to be action. So as a result of the research that you would have conducted, there's going to be action that would then be taken as a result of the work that you would have done. So if, for example, there's intervention strategies that have been recommended, those would be put in place. So the idea is that at the end of this research, there's going to be a shift, or there's going to be intervention strategies that will be put in place that would have resulted from this research. Often, when we conduct research for your master's or your PhD, what would happen is that there would be recommendations at the end of the research that this is a model, or these are suggested interventions that could be considered. And how many of those actually happen? How many of our work ends up in the library with many recommendations, with many suggestions, with models that have been suggested by us as researchers, by you as student also conducting research, right? So with action research, it's different. It's not just the suggestion that is made, but what you then come up with, actually, the next step then becomes it being put into action. All right. So that's action research. It's about taking action. Whereas participatory action research, on the other hand, it's research that actively involves participants in the research. So when you go into a particular community, the community become your core researchers. They become your collaborators. Many of the participatory action research scholars would actually even have their co-researchers in the community being co-authors in the papers that they publish as well, right? Because they would have been active and participating from the initial stages of the research, from the conceptualization of the research. Yes, that might be difficult or a bit of a challenge for you as a student. However, it's not impossible. Again, part of the decolonial agenda is to critique, is to challenge the methodologies that we use and the processes that we follow when we conduct research. So if we say we are interested in research that actually involves and takes seriously the ideas, contributions of the community, this is what it would or it should look like. Instead of us coming with interview schedules or surveys that are already prepared and then asking the community for that, for the information that we're interested in, right? So it involves a different layer altogether. Right? Participants are involved in the various stages of the research, including sometimes coming up with the research questions themselves. So when you apply for ethical clearance, they say, what are your research questions? What are you going to be asking? So when you're doing participatory action research, you may not have the research questions in a sense of the interview schedule, because you want to engage with the community to be directed by or in conversation with the community on the direction of the research that you want to conduct. So in this case, you can say, here's my theme, here's my topic, here's what I'm interested in. How it's going to take shape or form will be determined by when I get to the community. These are the steps that I would like to take. I do not have research questions or interview questions. These are the umbrella themes that I hope to cover. I'm interested in this phenomenon, but how I will approach it will be determined by the conversations with the community, right? So it's about emancipation and it's about empowerment of people. So that does not come after the fact, where you say, when you've done the research and you've got your data and hopefully your data gets used, people will be empowered as a result of the work that you would have conducted, right? So this becomes part of the process. Sometimes some of the community members gain the skills also of conducting research, of putting together a survey in the way that we do in academic spaces. Sometimes they might even teach us of different ways of conducting research, other research designs or strategies that we can consider, right? So if you think about things like photo voice, which is quite recent in terms of allowing people to just take pictures and then decide on what they want to take pictures of in their community and how that relates to the ways in which they see a particular phenomena in their community. Let's say maybe drug abuse in the community, and then you give people a camera and say, in what way? How is the challenge? How do you understand the challenge of drug abuse in the community, right? And then not have 10 questions that follow that. So that's what you put forward. And then how the person interprets that is up to them in what maybe they choose to focus on. If they're doing photo voice, they go around the community taking pictures, and that would be how they are reflecting on their understanding and how they perceive the challenge of drug addiction or drug abuse within their community. And you may find that 10 or 15 or 20 people, if you've given 20 people cameras, would come with different pictures and different interpretations and different reflections of the different spaces, the different people, the different moments, the different understanding of what drug addiction is, what it looks like, how it manifests, and how is it a problem in the community. So then people also learn, but they're teaching us as well. And then there's data that is generated at the same time. So people become empowered in the process, and people can also become emancipated as well. Maybe some of the co-researchers in your research can end up working in the field where they're trying to respond or looking at ways to combat drug addiction in the community, right? So there's always lessons to be learned in the process. So that is the difference between the two. I hope that makes sense. Okay. And then another one said, I fully agree with engaging in African-centered ethical aspects, but don't you think it is mandatory to create portals of African-based research so that researchers get access to them and cross-pollinate best experiences? Absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is a brilliant comment from one of you. And I think creating portals or databases and ensuring that African-centered research outputs, research resources are easily available, doing that is very critical, because then we will move closer to decentering Euro-Western ethical principles or aspects and actually centering other forms of understanding ethical philosophies and ethical principles, right? And I'm saying more so because Euro-Western knowledge has been privileged. It continues to be privileged. Universities continue to have these sources in the majority, research outputs. When you read about African or rather ethical principles, you would hardly get easily the research ethics principles that are from other parts of the world or from indigenous people in other parts of the world. And this is because the Euro-Western knowledge or understanding continues to be privileged. And therefore, cross-pollination, opening up to other sources of knowledge, particularly within the continent, is very pertinent. And that way, we can move towards learning best practices and learn from experiences from other contexts, and not only through one center that assumes to be universal, right? So I absolutely agree with your comment. I think it's brilliant. Okay, and then there was a question. I had to go do a bit of homework here, and I learned quite a bit along the way as well. So thank you to the student who asked this question, that as we are talking about Africanization and decolonization, and we're talking about Africanizing ethical principles, um, we will be, and we have been, I would like to assume, confronted with other cultural perspectives, which for a very long time we have automatically used the Euro-Western lens, and in many ways then problematize the cultural experiences of people and pathologize them. And so when we open up to other ways of knowing and being, we have the opportunity to look at different perspectives in which we can respond to challenges, right? So the question was about a married person or a married young person. So if a husband who's over 18 is married to a woman or a girl who is 15 years old, what happens when it comes to ethics clearance and the issues of consent, right? And then here the addition was also, at what stage will the application of kaupapa and SEN code become applicable without creating conflict with established norms and standards, right? So this is work in progress, I always say. When we use kaupapa, when we use the SEN code, what are the implications for what we are already using, which is the Euro-Western ethical principles based on the Geneva Convention, right? And I think based on last week's session, you saw that they don't necessarily cancel each other, but they offer an opportunity for acknowledging others which have been excluded by the Geneva Convention ethics principle. So here's the answer that I got. I'm sure you've been reading it already. The Children's Act of 2005 sets the minimum legal age of marriage at 18 for girls and boys. However, inconsistencies and loopholes, as we know with many systems that sometimes don't speak to each other, exist throughout the legislation. On the other hand, the Marriage Act, moving from the Children's Act, the Marriage Act of 1961 allows girls to be married at the age of 15 with parental consent, right? But maintains the minimum age of 18 for boys. So only girls can get married when they're younger than 18, but boys have to be 18. The Recognition of Customary Marriage Act of 1998 allows minors to enter into customary marriage without parental consent. You can see all the different layers, right? And this one does not specify minimum age for both boys and girls. If a girl, and this is what we're interested in based on the question that was asked by one of you, if a girl of 15 and older has concluded a lawful marriage in terms of the Marriage Act, and the parents or guardians have consented thereto, she will no longer be a minor, but will attain majority, so she can do things on her own without requiring consent. This means that this girl will not need her husband's consent to participate in research, for example, which is what we're interested in. She may also conclude contracts without parental consent, so those are other things. And so within the UNISA context, because that's where you are as a student, and if you were to do research that would lead you to be confronting these issues, you need to then know and understand that UNISA Ethical Committee will follow the acts as stipulated above, right? So if you're conducting a study at UNISA and you are confronted with wanting to do a study among married women who are between 15 and 17 years old, you want to understand their experiences, their perceptions, and all of that. If they are lawfully married according to the acts stipulated here, you can conduct research with them without their husband's consent, because as soon as they get married, they are no longer minors. All right. So the shift towards an Africa-centered ethics and acknowledging other ethical codes is work in progress, as I've said, responding to the Kaupapa and SEN code. And UNISA is currently revisiting as part of the Africanization project. So I know that as an institution, we are looking at the importance of indigenization of research ethics. And these are some of the things that are in the works. Okay, but you can use the SEN code. You can draw from other codes, as I said, depending on the focus of your research and what you're asking in your research. Okay, I gave an example also of Henrietta Lacks, an African-American woman whose cells were used for research by researchers. And this was way back, right, in 1951, when she was diagnosed with cancer. And then when they took tissues from her body, they later learned that actually she has cells that continue to regenerate. That was in 1951. And today in 2023, her cells are still being used, right? So the challenge here is that we're talking about research, and research is not innocent, especially when it comes to like your clinical trials in the medical field, because there's also big pharma involved, there's pharmaceuticals involved, there's also universities that benefit from the research. So there's money that is being made. So researchers and pharmaceuticals have been making a lot of money, because when we're talking about the cells that are regenerating and that can be used for other illnesses, right? And let me just read here. The sample was later used to create a human cell line that can reproduce itself outside of the body, right? Which is now known as the HeLa cells. The cells have been used to develop the polio vaccine, in vitro fertilization, one of the most expensive procedures in vitro, gene mapping, when we're talking about genomics research as well, and advancements in cancer research, and then AIDS research, which also later came, and then cloning and stem cell studies. These are a lot of research, but also a lot of money and dollars for big pharmas, as I said, but also for universities that are conducting this kind of research. So the family has been fighting this battle of getting justice for Henrietta Lacks' cell that have contributed so much to humanity, right? They filed a lawsuit, and you can see it's very recent, in 2021, arguing that they knowingly profited from Lacks' tissue sample and her cell line. And they never acknowledged her. They never acknowledged her family. They never acknowledged the contribution that she made. So over years, over time, and today as we're talking, now there has been that acknowledgement. And this is part of the legacy and the history of research and how violent research can be. Why is it important for us to have this conversation today? Because it forms part of the decolonization agenda. The decolonization agenda argues that we need to revisit this history to understand, because some of these continue to happen even today. It's quite unfortunate, but it continues to happen because other human beings are still considered subhuman. And it's exciting. It's good news that the family won and they've reached a settlement, right, with the biotech company for the cells of their family member. Okay. So I want to give an example again of another case before I jump into today's session. Okay. All right. I'm going to play it from here.
Imagine someone persuaded you to take part in a clinical trial, then used your DNA to conduct experiments you knew nothing about. How would you feel? The Havasupai were once a prosperous community of skilled hunters and farmers, whose territory covered 1.6 million acres of land in and around the Grand Canyon. They survived wars, Western expansion, and the federal government's confiscation of their ancestral lands. But by the 1980s, they were living on a reservation of just 440 square miles. They had limited access to fresh water or health care, and mysteriously, more than half of Havasupai adults suffered from type 2 diabetes, a potentially fatal condition that affects how the body turns food into energy. In 1990, the tribe was approached by researchers at Arizona State University to take part in a clinical trial to find out why. Approximately 100 donated blood and signed consent forms for their DNA to be used. Ultimately, the study failed to establish a genetic link between the Havasupai and diabetes. But that wasn't the end of the story. 13 years later, Carletta Tilausi, a member of the tribe, was attending a lecture at ASU when she discovered that the DNA had been kept and used to conduct research into alcoholism, schizophrenia, and inbreeding among the Havasupai, without their knowledge or consent. Outraged, participants in the trial filed a lawsuit against the university. 6 years later, it admitted to wrongdoing. The Havasupai were given $700,000 in damages, and their blood was ceremoniously buried. It was the first successful payout for misuse of DNA in U.S. history. What types of checks and agreements should be in place to reassure those who take part in clinical trials?
Hey. Apologies. So that is an example or another example of the ways in which research can abuse people in the communities. And here I'm not talking about things that happened 50 years ago or 70 years ago. This was a clinical trial that happened in 1990, which is not so long ago. And in 2003, a member of the community got to learn and understand that the research data that was collected in 1990 to try and understand diabetes was now used for other things. So the assumption here is that the Havasupai people are alcoholics. The Havasupai people are inbreeding, right? So there's incest happening. And they want to find scientific justification or merit so that they can make such claims about people, right? So the question is, when you're conducting research and you collect the data, remember, people sign informed consent and you are very clear what the research is about and what is going to be used for. So when you come back to the university or when you've now collected your data, you cannot now use the data for something different, for something else without people's agreement or people's consent. And in this case, it's this perpetuation of undermining of Indigenous people, particularly because of the focus of the research that was now being conducted with the blood that was drawn from people, trying to find DNA reasoning that will say, oh, they are genetically prone to being alcoholics, or they are those people who inbreed, right? And this is how research can be very dangerous. So even with the Geneva Convention and the ethical principles that came as a result of that, we still have research in 2003 where such kind of work that treats people with indignity continues. So I think it's very important that as researchers, as we're doing the work, that it's not just about ethics in terms of ticking the box, but it's about us being ethical human beings, right? Last week I spoke about the process of going through ethical clearance does not automatically indicate or lead to people doing moral and just things, right? So it therefore becomes very important for us to understand where people are, treating them with dignity, treating them with respect. You will remember across all the different principles and frameworks of ethics, at the core of it, or the common denominator, was about respect. So as a researcher, would you argue that you are respecting people, who they are, their history? If you then take the data that you've collected to do this kind of research where you want to prove a genetic link to alcoholism of a particular group of indigenous people, right? And then this takes us back to the idea or the moment of conquest, the moment of colonization, and what colonialists intended to do or they were hoping to achieve by conquering other nations. And this brings me now to today's session on decolonization and how you can think about your own research from a decolonial perspective, right? So we know and we understand our history of colonization and how colonization disrupted the progress and the development of many, many nations around the world. And when colonization ended, and it ended at different moments in different parts of the world. So many different countries within the African context, I will limit this to the African context, within the African context, got their independence at different moments in time. We know Ghana was the leader for us in the continent, and with us, South Africa, with apartheid that lasted and lingered, we were the last to really gain freedom, if we can call where we are right now free. And so when colonization ended, then we were decolonized. So we're no longer colonized, right? We moved to a different phase and a different stage, right? And there's a difference here between colonization and how we define it, and then decoloniality and how we define it. So while colonization has ended, and this is very critical in terms of how you frame your research, but particularly in terms of how you contextualize your research. So that very beginning part of your research in your chapter 1 or in your introduction, or how you make meaning of your data later, always understanding history and context becomes very, very important. So those of you who are doing discourse analysis, for example, this would be pertinent in terms of looking at how the systems are influencing and affecting the experiences and encounters that people have in the world, right? So many decolonial scholars argue that while we may have moved from active colonization moment, we are now in a moment called coloniality. So colonization ended, but coloniality continues. And coloniality is about how the official moment of colonization has ended. So in the case of South Africa, for example, we can move freely where we want to go. There's no longer segregation where there are signs that say whites only, right? And you can live wherever you want. You're not only limited to certain areas of the country. You can live wherever you want. And we know, obviously, wherever you want also means wherever you can afford, right? So access to resources, access to living wherever you want continues to be very contested because the resources continue to be very skewed, where the majority of the people do not have access to resources that allow them to live and have quality life, where the minority of people have got access to the majority of the resources. And this is how coloniality persists. Because the argument is, but if you can afford it, you can go wherever you want. If you can afford going to a private school or taking your children to a private school, by all means. But how do you afford when you do not have employment or proper employment? How do you afford going to a private hospital when you are working and earning just basic wage, right? So all of these things are part of what coloniality is. That, yes, we may say colonization, the shackles have been removed, literal shackles, but they continue to be there in many ways, right? Coloniality is there in our institutions because we continue to privilege Euro-Western forms of being and knowing. And that's why it's important, therefore, to say as part of the project of decolonization, we need to understand that it's an ongoing process. And because it's an ongoing process, then it's the process of decoloniality because we're dealing with coloniality. I hope that makes sense. Try to simplify something that might be more complex than that, right? And so when we're thinking about the importance of decolonizing, we think about this process at three levels, three major levels. And within these levels, of course, there are sub-levels that you can think about. So we need to decolonize at the level of power. We need to decolonize at the level of being, and we need to decolonize at the level of knowledge. So when we're talking about power, we're talking about capital, we're talking about access to resources, right? When you've got access to resources, money, then you are able to move, you are able to access better quality of life, you are better able to do things that gives you a decent living, right? So capital. And then governments, power at the level of governments, the role of the state, the role of free movement and who can move freely in the world. Why is it that someone from the United States can come to South Africa without a visa and they can be here for 90 days, for 3 months? But the opposite is not true. If you are here in South Africa, and I believe many other parts in Africa, if you want to go to the United States, you need a visa. You need to justify, you need to pay. So there's also that as well at the level of the governments, at the level of the state, who continues to hold the power, right? So when we're thinking about decolonization, how would this need to shift if we are to truly speak about decolonization? And I'm hoping that as I'm talking about this, you're also thinking about your own research as well. How is your research speaking to or linking to issues of capital? What kind of questions are you asking? And can you ask that question and link it to the broader power imbalances that we have that can assist you to make sense of the issue of unemployment, for example, and how is that linked to the issues of power, right? And then the legal systems, of course, the Dutch Roman law that we use, where is the space for customary law? Those of you who are in the legal fraternity or who are studying law, how are you entering the conversation? What informs our legal system? What are the implications of that when we think about African worldviews, African customary law, some of the practices that are there within our communities, the traditions, and how do those speak to or clash with the Euro-Western or the Dutch Roman law that we use, right? So all of these are systems of power, right, that our traditional leadership is governed under the government, right? The Euro-Western government that we follow and that we use. And again here, it's about adopting and continuing without questioning some of the systems that were put in place by the colonizers. And then when we inherit that, what are the implications, right? Where within the traditional leadership, there is dependency on the state to be able to fund, and what does that mean in terms of decision making as well, right? And then we need to decolonize at the level of being. Again, Frantz Fanon, the idea of different levels of being, the human and the subhuman, those who are at the center and those who are in the periphery, who counts as human. And that also speaks to who can just easily be discarded or killed by the police, and the police, and then there's no justice, right? So which bodies count and which bodies do not count? Who are the majority of people who are accessing public health systems that are not well resourced and therefore not treated with dignity, and those who access private, right? So the idea of being treated as fully human also speaks to or is linked to the kinds of treatment that people get in the different spaces that they occupy in the world. So how is our research attending to this idea of who counts as human? How is the research question that we're asking, that we're investigating, that we're exploring, the hypothesis that we're making, linked to the understanding of the human? And then, of course, the idea of knowledge. We've talked about this quite a bit, right? Whose knowledge matters, whose knowledge is privileged, which theories are we using, and what are the implications of using theories that were developed elsewhere to try and make sense and meaning of lived experiences in different contexts that are totally different from where the theories were developed, right? The indigenous knowledge systems, the ways of being and knowing of people that were erased deliberately by colonialism. So this idea of epistemic erasure becomes very important. And so how do we then do research in a way that speaks to this idea of epistemic erasure, where we move towards epistemic respect or epistemic plurality, where we acknowledge and understand multiple ways of being and knowing. So these are the different layers in which we can think about decolonization and how to decolonize. Okay, so decolonial thinking, its fundamental element, the fundamental element of decolonial thinking, involves, first of all, becoming aware of your own positioning and possible complicity in the colonial epistemic project, right? So when you look at your literature review, and we can have a conversation about this, when you look at your literature review, whom are you referencing? Who are the sources that you're using? And are they the sources that are deemed as primary sources in your field? Are they the sources that are encouraged? Have you looked at whether there are sources or research that has been conducted by African scholars, indigenous scholars, on the topic that you're writing about? And not doing so, what does that mean in terms of your own positioning, and therefore being possibly complicit in the epistemic colonial project, right? And it's also about the writings and teachings and learning from a decolonial perspective that needs to be consciously centered. And you, as the researcher, interrogating yourself about your position where you are, where you come from in terms of your history, in terms of your community, how that informs how you approach the research that you're doing, and ways in which you resist the colonial modes of being. How much do you question? How much do you critique? Do you have debates with your supervisor? I know that for many of the students, I don't want to challenge my supervisor. I don't want to alienate my supervisor. But then what happens in that moment where you leave your personal history at the door as a researcher? What happens in those moments, right? So I think as you complete your proposal or as you start your write-up project or the journey of writing up when you've already conducted your research, you need to really pause and reflect and think about what is it that you want to contribute, right, as a researcher. One of the very first psychology scholars in South Africa, Shabani Manganyi, speaks about this idea of being strangers to ourselves, how colonization has made us strangers to ourselves, but also how our disciplines as well have made us strangers to ourselves. And so he suggests that true learning should be about unlearning some of the truths that contributed to making us strangers to ourselves. As a psychology scholar and student, these are some of the questions that I had asked myself for a very long time, doing research as an undergraduate student and then later as a postgraduate student, about how our disciplines make us strangers to ourselves. Because we are given books, we are taught theories that were developed elsewhere, as I said earlier. And then these theories we have to carry with us and go back to the very communities that we came from, and then use these theories, whether you disagree with it or not, but we use these theories and end up pathologizing people, because this is what the theory says, that if you observe this, if you see this, if the result is this, therefore, this is what this means, right? Has context been taken into consideration? Has worldview of those people been taken into consideration? Has there been an attempt to really move beyond just what the textbook says, especially a textbook that was written and developed elsewhere? And this goes back to that example that I gave earlier of the Havasupai people, that when you use the data that you have uncritically, you are bound to come to conclusions that pathologize people, and that leads to labels that people have to carry, and even their next generation have to carry. So with the research that says we're using this blood to test and to check people's inclination, genetic inclination to becoming alcoholics, then it means if they are that way, then that's who those people are. And it means even the generations that come are already predefined before they even come. So this is about really challenging ourselves as researchers to say there has to be some unlearning that has to happen. And you are in an important position, a privileged position, if I can put it like that, as a researcher doing your master's, as a researcher doing your PhD, and where we're expecting you to come with independent thinking and original contribution to the discipline, to the body of knowledge. And this means critiquing, questioning the often taken for granted theories. And this is how we come to unlearn, but also come up with different kinds of truths, right? And you are in that privileged position to be able to do that. So, as I said, there are different ways in which we can look at decolonization, but it's really a project of centering those who have been put to the margins. It's a project of saying we need to go back in history, understand it, critique what we have learned with the hope of unlearning, but also with the hope of relearning some of the things that were erased and that were pushed aside, right? Seen as backward, seen as barbaric, seen as not useful. So a Hawaiian scholar, Pokalainui, comes up with 5 phases of decolonization, which I think can be useful. And I would like you again to think about them in the context of the research that you're doing. Lainui says we need to embark on a project of rediscovery and recovery. And this is very much in line with the Kenyan scholar Ngugi wa Thiong'o, right? Who also engages a lot with the issue of language. And how the colonizers came with the chalk and the barrel of a gun. And with that, our languages were thrown out. Our histories were thrown out. So it's about rediscovering that history that was thrown out. It's about recovering the languages that were delegitimized. And also getting to know ourselves again. So Manganyi's idea of how colonization has made us to become strangers to ourselves. Who are we? Our identity. So the recovery of who we are, it means regaining our identity again as a people. So it speaks to the decolonization, not only of the different levels I spoke about earlier, but decolonization of our minds. Because colonization was also a psychological warfare. It was physical and brutal, and people died, and there was a lot of genocide. But it was also at the psychological level. And this has impacted how we see ourselves and how we see each other. So when we think about the violence and the crime, and you're interested in doing research that focuses on the high levels of crime, you cannot just look at what's in front of you, but you need to understand it in context, right? So you really need to dig deep as you conduct your research, as you embark on your research. But decolonization is also about mourning. As much as we can look back, we can never truly recover everything. We know this. But it's also understanding that we are also in a perpetual state of mourning because of coloniality, because there continues to be this assault on us as the oppressed people and the colonized people. A few days ago, I read an article about a Kenyan scholar who's based in the United Kingdom. And she was there initially as a research fellow, funded project. And I think because of her excellence, she was later offered a full-time job. So as a fellow, she was focusing on doing research, and most of her research was in Kenya. So her family remained in Kenya, the husband and her child. But when she was offered a full-time job, she had already been spending a lot of time in the UK. When she was offered a full-time job at the University of Bristol in the UK, she then started the process of uprooting her child from Kenya to come to the UK so that she can be able to raise her child and have her child live with her. And this is a 6-year-old child. And she was hopeful. I can almost say confident that things will go well. She even started looking for a school and applying to the school for the child. And lo and behold, the immigration, the UK refused to give the child a visa. A 6-year-old, they refused to give the child a visa. And in their response letter, the letter, because the application was for the child, so it was submitted on behalf of the child. So it's the child's name and everything on the visa application, with the parent then, of course, as someone who's submitting on behalf of the child. And so in their response, they were responding to the applicant, and the applicant is the 6-year-old child. They indicated that they don't see any compassionate reason for them to give the child a visa. It is the mother's choice to move to the UK and to leave her child behind. And as a result, they were denying the child the visa. So the visa application was declined. This is in 2023, in November 2023. So when I speak about the continued assault on the oppressed people, these are some of the examples that we see every day. Earlier, I spoke about if you were to wake up tomorrow and go to the United Kingdom, you cannot just do that. You need to apply for that visa. And they can choose to say no, right? But when a UK person wants to come to Africa, to come to South Africa, they can just wake up, buy a ticket, and come to South Africa because they automatically have access to the continent. They have a 90-day visa entry to the continent. I know there's a country or two, I think it's Uganda, where recently the president decided that actually that's not okay. If you want a visa for us, we want a visa for you. And so this requires us to really think critically about what does it mean to decolonize in a moment where coloniality has taken hold. If you are a student in development studies, a student in sociology, a student doing migration studies, and you're dealing with things such as these, can you afford to do such a study without understanding the historical complexity of how colonization has influenced and moved to the current moment where such decisions can be made, such decisions are being made? And this is the mourning that I speak about, the mourning that is perpetual for the oppressed people. And decolonization is also about dreaming. It's about invoking our histories, looking back, being hopeful, and looking at the possibilities of drawing from some of the ways of doing and being that were actually useful for our communities. Indigenous knowledge system. Is it possible to center IKS in the work that we're doing? So this is a moment of dreaming, to say what is possible? What is possible without, again, these modes of being and knowledges being captured again? We know that IKS has become the buzzword. To what end? And what are the implications of that for Indigenous knowledges and the protection of Indigenous knowledges? What are the possibilities of IKS when we're thinking and rethinking issues of climate change and challenges of conservation, right? Dreaming is about decentering Euro-Western theories and imagine possibilities of theorizing from where we are. And this can move from dreaming to actually commitment with you as a researcher, as a scholar. How are you committed to change? How are you hoping your research to change and to contribute towards the reclaiming of these histories, towards the understanding of the challenges confronting us from this holistic perspective? How are you committed in the work that you're doing to the direction that society must go? What kind of change is necessary? How is your research answering that? Right? And also the plurivoice that is necessary, where Europe is not the center anymore, but we're creating space for multiple voices. How in your research are you committed to centering African voices through the sources that you use? Yes, maybe someone might argue in my discipline or with the study that I'm focusing on, there isn't much that is available from African scholars. Granted, what about other indigenous scholars from other parts of the world? Right? So it's important to actually make the effort to look at what is available, because from there are different kinds of lessons that can be learned, and we move away in the work that we're doing towards decentering the West. Right? And this speaks to the work that we're doing. It speaks to you taking action and doing a PhD or a master's or an honors project that is really committed towards change and rethinking that which has been taken for granted. And when we talk about change or wanting to see change, talking about that or thinking about that from the perspective of the contexts that we're in and the histories of the context that we're in being centered as well. So it's very critical. So ecologies of knowledge. I've spoken about the importance of the plurivoice, right? Pluriversal, moving away from the universality. And this would speak to who produces the knowledge. So you are conducting research right now. You're going to go into communities, you're going to go into the lab, you're going to conduct research and produce knowledge, right? But I would like to point you to Boaventura de Sousa Santos' notion of what he calls abyssal thinking. And here what de Sousa Santos speaks about is, or how he describes the abyssal thinking, is these invisible lines that separate what counts as knowledge. And often that which is outside of university walls is considered as unscientific, right? He says the beliefs that people have, the opinions, the subjective understandings, that which you're going to get when you go out into the community and conduct research interested in people's experiences or their perceptions, that kind of knowledge, as it stands, as it is not perceived as good enough or knowledge enough until we come back to universities and interpret and insert ourselves in people's stories, right? So people's beliefs and opinions and subjective understandings are ruled as not meeting the scientific truths. The scientific truth that has been defined at a particular moment from a particular location and in a particular context, right? So this would mean, and pardon my examples from psychology because that's the discipline that I come from, but I hope that it also resonates with you as you think about your own discipline as well. Within psychology, when we talk about grief and the different stages of grief, we engage with the theories, right, of grief, of bereavement. And the theories were developed in a different context, in a different part of the world, where a scholar such as yourself was curious and interested in the different moments that people go through as they grieve. And she spent time in a what is the place called where people who are just sitting and waiting for their final days, right? And she was interested in saying, what are the different moments and phases and steps that people go through as they grieve? And that went on to be used as the theory of grief, right? Where people are in denial and they get angry and then they bargain saying, you know, can this cancer just give me a second chance? Can I go into remission? You know, you bargain, I'll be a good person, I'll stop drinking, all of that. If that doesn't happen, then you get angry. Then it gets to a point where you really accept the fate as it is, right? So that's the example. And these are the different phases and stages of grief. And that has been used in different contexts to say this is how people grieve. This is how the bereavement process of people happens from a psychological perspective. However, when it comes to rethinking that I'm calling for in the unlearning, it affords you the opportunity to say, but is that really the case in that particular community in Mpumalanga? Is that the case within the South African context, for example? In what ways do people deal with bereavement? What beliefs do they have? What are their subjective understandings of what bereavement is? If you think about many of the African funerals and the different stages and processes that people go through, and this we saw also during COVID, where particular rituals or ceremonies or these steps of bereavement could not be done. Some people actually did not listen to the restrictions that were put in place because they understood and believed that it's important for those processes of bereavement to take place, which they believe actually contributes towards someone accepting what has happened to them and also healing from what has happened. So the kind of support that is offered. And a psychology scholar, Agustin Noe, came up with the different stages and processes of bereavement and grief from an African context, right? And using that, or if you were to do a research within the African context, within the Nigerian context, because you used Nigeria, which is where it comes from, within that context to say, okay, I'm interested in funerals, or I'm interested in people's bereavement processes, or I'm interested in how people cope with death and loss. Then you can draw from people like Agustin Noe, right? So it's about how you engage with your community and learn from your community and actually move towards the possibility of even coming up with theories that are based from the lessons that you have learned from your community. And this then shifts, right? It shifts from you coming in with a predetermined theory that you then impose and use within the community to try and make sense of people's processes of bereavement. Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, she's an Indigenous woman from New Zealand, and she's done a lot of work on decolonizing research practices. And she argues that when Indigenous peoples become the researchers and not merely the researched, which has been the case for a very long time, the activity of research is transformed. And I would argue that the activity of research should be transformed because it has been a while now that we as Indigenous people, those who are Indigenous people in particular part of the world, have become researchers. There continues to be this regurgitation or continuing, again, as part of coloniality, continuing with the status quo. And now the question is, what is then the point of having Indigenous people being researchers, indigenous people engaging with their own communities in a moment where we are beyond colonialism, but then we still use the tools and markers of colonialism to do the research that we're doing. So Tuhiwai Smith argues that the activity of research has to be transformed. And this is a challenge to all of us to then rethink how we are conducting our research. Is it transformative? Is our research contributing towards the transformation of research processes and how we approach research? Decolonization is concerned, she argues, with having a more critical understanding of the underlying assumptions, of the motivations, and the values that inform research practices. If you were to think about it, what were the underlying assumptions, motivations, and values that informed the researchers that decided to use people's blood to try and test and look at the genetic link to alcoholism and inbreeding? So it's very, very important to think about the underlying assumptions that you come with as a researcher, as you do the research in clinical trial, in the lab, in the community, in the field, right? And this then also speaks to method. Method is important as it represents a set of conventions of how knowledge is gathered and codified. And that's why it's important for you to also challenge yourself and to think outside the box and not limit yourself to focus groups or interviews or surveys or questionnaires. When you involve community members, there's an opportunity for you to actually come across the potential of learning about other ways, other methods of collecting data. So are we open to learning as researchers? Tuhiwai Smith continues that there are numerous oral histories which tell of what it means, what it feels like to be present while your history is erased before your eyes, while your history is dismissed as irrelevant, while your history is ignored or rendered as the lunatic ravings of drunken old people, for example, right? And so she says using decolonial approach means being committed to challenging this, being committed to producing research knowledge that documents the social injustice that perpetuates, that continues in our society, in our communities. Research that recovers knowledges that have been subjugated for a very long time. We cannot do this if we only limit ourselves to Euro-Western ways of understanding the world and theories. It's also about being committed to helping to create spaces for the voices of the silenced to be expressed and to be listened to. And that's why research design such as, or epistemology such as participatory action research are so critical because they're about emancipation and empowerment. It offers space for the voices of the silenced to be listened to. When community members become co-researchers, then their voices are heard in a different way that they are or would be if we only just interview people. And doing research that also challenges racism, colonialism, and oppression. So this is really a challenge from Linda Tuhiwai Smith. I'm moving towards the end now because I'm also interested in some of your thoughts, some of your comments, and some questions that you hopefully will have as you think about decolonization and Africanization in line with the research that you're currently busy with or are thinking about. So the project of Africanizing in itself is a decolonizing or a decolonial one, because it involves the undoing of colonialism. When you Africanize, you're saying these other theories, while they might be helpful or useful to a point, they are insufficient for the African context. It's about undoing the lies of colonialism in all its forms within Africa, so that matters concerning the African condition are discussed, where we can really engage the challenges and issues of what's happening in places like the DRC right now, right? In how the resources continue to be taken and taken and taken at the expense of people's well-being and livelihood, where people die, where children die every day, right? How do we do work and research that attends to these things that are often hidden or misrepresented by the media? And research that leads and moves us towards resolving African problems or challenges in our own terms, and also do work that is in the interest of Africa. And lastly, the very invocation of Africanizing, when we choose to Africanize, like when we're talking about Africanizing research ethics, the very idea or step to move towards Africanizing is about deconstructing and decentering colonial and imperial knowledge, in the sense that Europe and America is no longer, or are no longer, the centers of knowledge. Because the assumption that Europe and America are the centers of knowledge perpetuates the idea that Africa's interests cannot be given attention by Africans themselves. So as researchers who might be or are African, as researchers in Africa, how is our research, our work, contributing and speaking to resolving issues in the interest of Africa and on the terms that are set by Africa? So let us make sure that the research that we do, the research that we conduct, matters with all of these things in mind. And so I shall pause here and give us an opportunity to be in conversation on this. Okay. All right. Okay, so I'm interested in your thoughts, conversations, and possible debates on this. Okay. Not seeing the questions yet. It's just a note on that question that was asked by Waldo last week on the issue of consent for a wife, a married woman who's 15 years old. Okay. All right, I'll just give it a moment to see and to have you reflect, and hopefully have a question or two or five for us to discuss. Want to tell me you don't have any questions today? I hope it made sense, though, to all of you, if not anything, to get you really thinking about the work that you're currently doing, the work that you're thinking about, and also as you go into the field, as you go and conduct your research, that you do so having had a critical engagement with yourself, but also an overview in terms of how you frame your work in the context that you're doing the work, acknowledging the history that might have influenced or that has influenced how you think about the research that you're doing. So I think that's just very important. So please think about it. Thank you very much, Liz. Liz says it was thought-provoking, so I'm going to assume that yeah, it's leading you to reflect quite a bit. Thank you, Liz. Okay, I'm going to give it 1 more minute, and if there are no questions, I will then call it a day. And as I always say, if questions come after, because sometimes, and I think topics such as this sometimes can be heavy for some students, and they might require a minute or two, or even a day or a week to reflect and think about the issues that we discussed as you go back to your own work. And if that is the case, please remember, you can always just send an email with the question that you have. And then we will share the answer with you. Okay. I was trying to get a bit of time moving to see if maybe there will be a question or two. I'm not seeing. Okay. So the reference to the research and the framing within the context of mourning is an interesting take. Okay. Great. Okay, everybody. I think from what I'm getting, it's comments and reflections on what was shared. And so perhaps not so much questions tonight, which is also okay. We don't always have to have questions. Then it means we will have an early evening then. We will stop here. And I would like to thank you very much for attending the session, not only this session, but the previous sessions as well since we started. It's been wonderful. It's been wonderful sharing this space with all of you, engaging with you, hearing your questions and your comments. This is the last session for me for this year. I wish you all the best with the finalization of your proposals, with the finalization of the other parts of the research that you're doing, maybe writing your chapters. All of the best. It's been wonderful. Yes, indeed, it is my last session for the year. The 2024 sessions will start shortly after the registration period has closed, because it's important that we don't start in a staggered manner. So only after the closing date, I think Dino will give a direct answer in terms of whether it will be in April or it will be in May, but it's usually after the registration has closed for master's and doctoral students, when we know that everyone has settled and you've started working on your proposals or the research that you're doing, then the sessions will start. Okay. So towards the end of the first part of the year is usually when the sessions will start. Just keep an eye out. There's always notices, and we look forward to having you with us then. Okay, I'm seeing some questions now. Okay. All right, Anonymous. The reason why I'm busy talking is to give you a moment to formulate a question if you do have, and to continue reflecting. I see someone was saying we shouldn't end just yet. So it's 4 minutes before past. So maybe we'll just give it until past in case someone does come up with a question and we have closed them out. So one of you has asked that please give it a bit of time as you frame your questions. Yeah, there's the email that you can send your queries and your questions to. Okay. The time it takes to display the questions takes long. Okay, I'll take that into consideration and give it a moment, understanding that maybe someone is formulating a question and the system is just slow. in publishing the question. Okay. All right. So as we wait for the questions, I just want to remind you that the publications, or rather the sessions, the presentations are available after the session. Sometimes during the session, you might miss a point or two, but you always have the opportunity to revisit, which I think is a great opportunity where you can go and sit and even pause where you want to pause and listen to the presentation once again, or revisit the presentation when you're working on a particular part of your research, and then you want to remind yourself of what was discussed that you think would be useful. You can always do that. But also, the questions that I spoke to earlier are still going to be published as well. So the questions from last week, I did indicate that I will speak to them tonight, but also understanding that maybe those who asked the questions last week could not attend today. So to just be fair to them, we will be sharing those questions and answers on the platform as well. So just please make sure that you have a look at the platform as well to make sure. Okay. So, okay, another comment. Decoloniality is a very complex topic. I'm confused by it, but the presentation was an eye-opener. Okay, I understand. It requires you to really spend time, read and read and read. There's quite a lot, and maybe that can in itself can be confusing, but there's quite a lot of material that is available. Please read African scholars, a lot of Latin American scholars that have written on decoloniality, and also depending on the interest that you have. If you're interested in history, if you're interested in feminism, if you're interested, so the different forms of approaching also the subject is there. I'm glad that at least the presentation was an eye-opener. I tried to frame it as simple as possible, understanding that it's a more involved project and concept and topic. So I think the more you engage with it, the more it starts making sense to you as well. Okay. Yes, it is a must to incorporate in your research. You are in health studies. By all means, I think the examples that were given speak directly to you, and also just how you're going to approach your work within the health studies field. And all the best with that. Okay, so you're still concerned with the participatory action research and action research. What particularly are you concerned with? I try to explain it as simply as possible. So perhaps you can explain what maybe is your concern. And if maybe it's because it's something that you're interested in for your own research, you're more than welcome to send me an email and then tell me what your focus in and how you're wanting to approach it, and what your specific concern is. And then we can take it from there. Okay. So it's really, really just about how you approach the research, right? And if maybe we can use the first letter of PAR, which is P, and use that as a guide, maybe, that it's participatory, right? And the participation being spoken about here is the participation of the community members. It's the active participation, right? Active participation of the community members. So it's action research, but the other one, the difference is that there's this active participation of the community members, and the community members are co-creators. They are co-investigators in the research that you're doing. Whereas with action research, you are the researcher. You don't necessarily have to engage the community from the beginning to the end in terms of the participation and the research process, in the questions that you're asking, in the process that you're using. They don't have to collect data as it happens also in participatory action research. The idea with action research is that at the end of the research, when you've done the research, what can I say? You're going to have a product. So there's a tangible product that you're going to have, which may not necessarily be the case with participatory action research. Participatory action research would often do to really deal with like social justice issues. That is broad, I know, but social justice issues such as access to healthcare, and you want to highlight the problematic nature of accessing healthcare. So you're working with people in a community, and they're engaging with what are the issues and challenges with accessing healthcare. And they can speak about the experiences, they can speak to other community members about the experiences, and the idea is to highlight how the healthcare system is unjust, because it's not easily accessible, because people struggle. They go to clinics and queue the whole day, for example. And so people are participating actively in that process of highlighting something that is unjust, critiquing something that is unjust, and then coming up with recommendations or suggestions, or even approaching the health ministry to engage on this issue, right? Whereas with action research, on the other hand, you actually come up with a way or a template, perhaps, maybe saying instead of clinics closing at 4, clinics should close at 7. And then you actually take steps towards ensuring that the health system adheres to this, so that this gets put into action, where clinics end up closing at 7 instead of 4, based on the research that you would have conducted, right? Often action research is also linked to commissioned research, where you are asked as a researcher to go and answer a particular question so that there can be a solution to a particular thing. Maybe a company is interested in rethinking or revamping something. So with the research that you're doing, it gives them a clear solution on how they can be able to do that. I hope that helps, Anonymous. But like I say, if your question is linked to a specific project that you're interested in or are busy with, you're more than welcome to continue the conversation with me via email. Okay. I'm doing a topic on decoloniality in the public health sector. Interesting presentation. Excellent. I'm very happy to hear that. All right. Okay. I'm not seeing any more comments or questions. Thank you for the few that we had now. Yes, absolutely. PAR and AR, and you're saying PAR is also intervention type of research. Yes, correct. Both of them are intervention based, right? But with PAR, it's not necessarily the outcome that you will get as in the case of action research. Is it not only descriptive and analytical, but is a process with a context and community? PAR and AR is also intervention type of research. So you're mentioning two things, but you're speaking in singular form. So it is not only descriptive and analytical, but is a process with a context and community. Okay, why? you're mentioning both of them, so I'm not sure which one you're referring to. But I think in terms of intervention, the idea at the end is about intervention. It may not necessarily be the case with PAR, but that is the aim and the end result of what you want to get with AR. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Because even with the other types of research that researchers would conduct, the idea is that there will be, or that's the hope, unless if you're doing a strictly conceptual, interested in just questioning and analyzing something kind of research. Most of the research, when you go and you investigate, you explore, is you want to get a better understanding, but also it could be because you're hoping that your research will provide a rethinking and steps that can lead to a model or intervention or a strategy towards approaching a particular issue. That's what PAR also wants to do, right? It's about the possibility of intervention. Action research is about that intervention. Okay, so it would be incomplete if the intervention is not the end result. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Okay, can we also have topics around model development, as most PhD studies require that? Okay, noted. And my colleagues are also listening in, and I think that will be noted. And as we put together a schedule for 2024, Anonymous, I think that is something that will also be considered as well. And then maybe there can be a session focusing on model development and how does one think about that, and what would be involved and how would your research lead to model development, right? So actually interrogating it and thinking about what the possibility of that would look like, and not just have it as a recommendation, but actually coming up with a model. I think that's actually a good idea. Thank you for suggesting that. And I'm looking in the direction of my colleagues here, that it will be noted down as a possible session to be included for 2024. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, I am so happy that we are now on the same page. And thank you to everybody as well. Now I am finally, I think this time seriously saying good night, good afternoon, goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much for your generosity and for your participation in all the sessions. I look forward to seeing some of you next year, and I wish all of the best with your future endeavors, those of you who are finalizing their studies this year. All the best and well done to those who are leaving the system. Okay, everybody, goodbye.